I invited my son for Christmas, but he abandoned me coldly. The dinner was left untouched. A courier delivered their note. Tears fell, but a secret emerged. A hidden cabin changed my fate. They tried to take my life away, but my revenge changed everything. Christmas was never meant to be quiet. Not in George Whitman's house. For decades, the holiday had been a symphony of sound and warmth. His wife Laura bustling around the kitchen with her apron tied loosely at the waist, the smell of cinnamon rolls weaving through every room, and his son David tearing open presents with a kind of uncontainable joy that only children can summon. But this year, the house felt different. It was his first Christmas without Laura, and he had been clinging to the hope that family, at least, would bridge the silence. George had gone to great lengths to prepare for the day. He decorated the house the way Laura always loved it, gold lights glowing on the porch, old ornaments hanging from the tree, the dining table dressed in its finest with china, polished silver, and napkins folded into fans. The meal was a labor of devotion. Rosemary roast beef marinated for 2 days, garlic mashed potatoes smoothed to perfection, pecan pie baked just the way Laura would have wanted, cooling by the window. Each detail was an act of remembrance, as if recreating tradition might bring her back, if only in spirit. But underneath the preparation sat a quiet, nervous anticipation. All he wanted was for David and his wife Melissa to walk through the door. Their laughter, their presence, their acknowledgement that even without Laura, this home was still theirs. George checked the driveway more times than he cared to admit, each glance carrying the silent hope of headlights cutting through the snow. Instead, what arrived was a courier. A young man, barely in his 20s, in a red windbreaker and thin gloves. He held an envelope with a name neatly written across it, George Whitman. There was no warmth in his delivery, just efficiency. He handed it over, nodded once, and returned to his car. The crunch of boots on frozen ground and the cough of an old engine were the only sounds that followed. George stood with the envelope in his hand, heavy with the kind of dread that needs no confirmation. He didn't even need to open it to know. The weight of absence had already filled the room. But he broke the seal anyway. The handwriting was unmistakable, Melissa's, small and looping. Just one short message. George, we decided to spend Christmas at my mom's this year. Hope you understand. Love, Melissa. That was all. No Merry Christmas. No phone call. No promise to visit another day. Just words that carved deeper than silence itself. George's eyes drifted back to the dining room glowing under the chandelier. The roast beef sat steaming, the potatoes still creamy, the pie catching the light. A feast prepared for celebration, now reduced to decoration. He lowered himself into the head chair, the seat where Laura once glanced at him with quiet pride as their son and his wife joined them at the table. But this time, there was only empty space. The first bite of food turned to dust in his mouth. No matter how perfectly seasoned, it tasted of loneliness. He set his fork down, blew out the candles, and began packing everything into containers. All but the pie. That he left on the counter uncovered. Laura had always left dessert out, just in case someone stopped by. It was a small ritual of hope he couldn't quite abandon, even though the truth pressed hard against him. No one was coming. Later, scrolling through his phone for distraction, George saw what he had dreaded, the proof of choice. On Facebook, Melissa's mother had posted a photo of her own table. Long, crowded, overflowing with food and laughter. At the far end sat David, his hand resting on Melissa's, smiling brighter than George had seen in years. The caption read, "So grateful for a house full of family this Christmas." Grateful. That word struck like a stone. They were grateful for the table they chose, but not for his. For the first time, George admitted the truth out loud. It wasn't that they had forgotten him. It was that they had chosen someone else's table over his. The Christmas betrayal was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet. A courier's delivery, a short note, a photograph online. Yet it was enough to fracture something inside him. What began as a day of tradition ended as a day of reckoning. And though George didn't yet realize it, this moment was the first move in a story far bigger than abandoned dinners and broken traditions. Because Laura had seen it coming, and she had left behind more than memories. The silence in the house grew heavier after the courier's car pulled away. George stood in the hallway, the sealed envelope still in his hand, staring at the lights wrapped around the porch railing. They cast a warm glow over the snow-dusted steps, but the warmth stopped at the threshold. Inside, the air felt colder, as though Laura's absence had seeped into the walls themselves. He walked back into the dining room. The meal sat waiting like a stage set for actors who would never appear. Every detail carried Laura's touch. The parsley sprig on the potatoes, the folded napkins, the flicker of candles that mirrored the way she used to prepare for guests. George sat at the table, pouring himself a glass of sweet tea. He tried to eat, tried to carry on as if the evening wasn't collapsing in on itself. But each bite turned tasteless, swallowed more out of duty than appetite. The loneliness wasn't new. Laura had passed 5 months earlier, and George had been living in its shadow ever since. But holidays had a way of magnifying absence. Where there should have been laughter, there was only the tick of the living room clock. Where there should have been Laura's voice humming carols while she worked in the kitchen, there was the pop of the fire, hollow and indifferent. He found himself staring at the Christmas tree in the corner. The gold star on top leaned slightly to the left, imperfect. It was the same star David had made in 3rd grade, one point broken off long ago. Laura had always insisted on putting it front and center. "It's perfect as it is," she used to say. George wondered what she would have said about tonight. Maybe she would have told him to let it go, not to take it personally. But he knew she would have also seen the truth. This wasn't about dinner, or even about the holiday. It was about what it meant that his son and his son's wife were pulling further away, replacing his table with another. Scrolling through his phone, George lingered on the Facebook photo of David and Melissa at Melissa's mother's house. The room was alive with chatter and wine glasses catching the light. His son, his only child, looked at ease, smiling in a way George hadn't seen in years. The caption, "So grateful for a house full of family," stung deeper with every reread. They had chosen where to belong, and it wasn't with him. Memories rushed in uninvited. Christmas mornings when David was small, waking at dawn, racing down the hallway in his pajamas, the smell of cinnamon rolls filling the air. Laura would pull them from the oven, powdered sugar still dusting her hands, while George read The Night Before Christmas by the fire. Those days, the house was the center of joy, the place family came together. Back then, he never imagined a time when his son would choose another table, another family. He tried to convince himself it was just life. Married couples split holidays. People get busy. But a courier on Christmas Day, that wasn't business, it was dismissal. It was a message, sharp and undeniable. As the night dragged on, the emptiness became a presence of its own. He turned off the chandelier, blew out the candles, and packed the meal into the fridge. Still, he couldn't bring himself to cover the pie. Maybe it was habit, or maybe it was Laura's voice echoing in his mind, reminding him to leave it out just in case. Later, George moved to his recliner in the living room. The chair groaned under his weight, the same chair he had sat in every Christmas night for decades. Across from him sat Laura's chair, untouched since she passed, her knitting basket still by its side, yarn halfway unraveled. He hadn't been able to move it. It was easier to let it sit there, as if she might return at any moment. Outside, a car passed on the wet road, its headlights sweeping across the wall. For a second, his heart leapt. Maybe they had changed their minds. Maybe they were coming after all. But the car kept going, leaving behind only shadows. George leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. He tried to tell himself it was just one holiday. But he knew better. This wasn't an isolated moment. This was the culmination of years of slow drifting, the final confirmation that what was once whole was now fractured. When he finally gave up on pretending to watch television and headed to bed, his eyes landed on a framed photo sitting on the dresser. It was from their last Christmas with Laura. David and Melissa had come that year, though they'd arrived late, already full from another dinner. In the photo, Laura's smile was radiant, lighting the room as always. David was polite, present but distant. George sat on the edge of the bed, staring at that photo until his vision blurred. When he lay down, the space beside him was cold. For the first time, he allowed himself to admit what Laura had likely known all along. David and Melissa hadn't forgotten him. They had chosen someone else's table. The morning after Christmas, George woke earlier than usual. Not that he had really slept. Most of the night had been spent staring at the ceiling, replaying the day over and over. The rejection, the empty table, the photo on Facebook. His mind felt restless, unsettled. He made his way into the kitchen, but even the thought of coffee seemed hollow. Something in him resisted slipping into routine, as if life was nudging him toward something different. He stepped outside instead, sweater pulled tight against the winter air. The yard wore a thin coat of frost, each blade of grass outlined in white. The bird bath was frozen solid. Laura had always started her mornings out here, no matter the season. She'd check the bird feeder that hung from the maple tree at the edge of the yard. Back then, George never understood it. Why feed the birds in the dead of winter? She used to smile and say, because they still need to eat, even when no one else is watching. Following that old habit of hers, George walked the path to the feeder. The wooden house-shaped box swung lightly in the breeze, empty as usual. But when he reached up to touch it, his fingers brushed something unexpected, an envelope wedged tightly between the post and the sloped roof. At first he thought it must have been trash caught by the wind, but the moment he pulled it free, his breath caught in his throat. His name was written on the front. Just George. Not Mr. Whitman. Not George Whitman. Exactly the way Laura always wrote it on birthday cards and grocery notes. His hands trembled as he turned the envelope over. In the corner, there was a date. Nearly 6 months ago. 1 week before Laura passed. His heart beat faster, his chest tight with the impossible weight of it. He stood frozen for a moment, scanning the yard as though someone else might be there to confirm what he was holding. But there was only the quiet, the frost, and the faint sound of a crow overhead. Back inside, George sat at the kitchen table, staring at the envelope. He traced the letters of his name with his thumb, almost as if touching them would bring her back. For a full minute, he couldn't bring himself to break the seal. Finally, he did. The paper inside was neatly folded, Laura's handwriting unmistakable. The words were short, direct. If you're reading this, something has happened that I hoped wouldn't. Go to my desk, top drawer. There's more. That was it. No greeting, no explanation, no signature. But her tone was clear, calm, certain, and deliberate. Laura had planned this. George's chair scraped against the floor as he pushed back and hurried down the hall to the study. Laura's desk had sat untouched since the day she passed. Her reading glasses still rested on top of a stack of crossword puzzle books. A ceramic dish held paperclips, her favorite pen still tucked inside a cup. He opened the top drawer. At first, all he saw were the usual things, stationery, notepads, stamps. But running his hand along the bottom, he felt something taped underneath. Carefully, he peeled it free. Another envelope, this one thicker, heavier. A brass key was clipped to the outside with a paperclip. Inside was a folded document and another note in Laura's hand. George, if David ever shuts you out, this will make sense. You'll find everything you need at the place this key opens. It's yours. Always was. You just didn't know it. His breath came uneven now, a mix of awe and unease. She had known. She had seen something coming he had refused to acknowledge. She had prepared for it in silence, tucking her foresight away for the day he would need it most. The document he unfolded next was a deed. His name was printed in bold. The address listed was one he didn't recognize, in Hendersonville, a small town about 40 minutes away. A house. A property he had never known existed. For a long moment, George just sat there, staring at the paper. Questions flooded in. Why had Laura kept this from him? Why had she tied it to David, possibly shutting him out? What else had she seen that he hadn't? He turned the key over in his hand. The brass was cool, edges worn from use, polished as though someone had taken care of it. The idea of calling someone crossed his mind, maybe Carl, his neighbor and old friend, but the thought of explaining all of this over the phone felt wrong. No, this was something he needed to see for himself. George carried the key and deed back to the kitchen, laying them carefully on the table. His hands were still trembling. For the first time since Laura's death, the emptiness inside him shifted. It wasn't gone, but it wasn't as heavy. It had been replaced by something else. Mystery, anticipation, a faint flicker of hope. Whatever this was, Laura had left it for him. Not David. Not Melissa. For him alone. And that meant he couldn't ignore it. By mid-morning, George had made up his mind. The key lay on the table, its brass edges catching the pale light drifting in through the blinds. The deed beside it looked as official as anything he had ever signed in his life, his name in bold letters, as if daring him to question its legitimacy. Hendersonville, a town he had driven past countless times on the way to the lake, never stopping, never thinking it might hold a piece of his own story. He packed a small overnight bag. A change of clothes, a flashlight, his wallet, and the old thermos Laura had always insisted he take on long drives. He made a sandwich, filled the thermos with coffee, and before zipping the bag shut, his eyes landed on a cardigan draped over the chair in the bedroom. Laura's old blue one, the one she wore while reading in bed. He touched the sleeve for a moment, then whispered into the quiet. "You thought ahead, didn't you?" The drive was quiet, the kind of silence where even the hum of the tires on asphalt felt amplified. Bare trees lined the road, stark against the winter sky. George passed landmarks that stirred old memories. The frozen lake where Laura had once skated clumsily. The hardware store she used to drag him into on Saturdays. Every mile carried him further from the ache of Christmas night and closer to whatever Laura had left behind. Hendersonville came into view sooner than expected. A scattering of small shops, a diner with neon signs, and a gas station that looked frozen in time. The address on the deed led him down a gravel road tucked behind a line of pine trees. Mailboxes marked the driveways in weathered numbers until one matched. He slowed, heart pounding. The house came into view, small, white, with blue shutters and a stone porch. It wasn't flashy, but it had a settled look, the kind of place that seemed to be waiting rather than abandoned. George parked in the driveway and stepped out, boots crunching on the gravel. The front steps creaked beneath his weight, as though testing him, as though the place itself was deciding whether to welcome him in. His hand closed around the key in his pocket. It slid into the lock like it belonged there, and with a soft click, the door swung open. He hesitated, breath held, before stepping inside. The air carried the faint scent of cedar, layered with something sweet, like old wood polished with care. Everything inside was neat, cared for, as though someone had kept it ready. In the living room, a wooden mantel held framed photographs. George's eyes landed on one of him and Laura on their 35th anniversary, smiling at the camera. Another showed Laura on the beach, hair whipping in the wind, sandals dangling from her hand. Then a third photo, one George had never seen, Laura sitting on the very porch outside, coffee cup in hand, smiling at someone just out of frame. He swallowed hard, his throat tightening. It felt less like stepping into a new place and more like walking into a room Laura had just left. The furniture was familiar, the same style of couch they had in their first house. The bookshelf arranged exactly the way Laura used to keep it. Mysteries on top, cookbooks on the bottom. On the coffee table sat a folded note. He reached for it, hands trembling. "This is yours, in case they ever forget who you are." No date, no signature. Just Laura's unmistakable script. George sat down slowly in the armchair, the note still in his hand. His chest ached, but it wasn't the ache of abandonment. It was the ache of recognition. Laura hadn't just left him memories. She had left him security, a refuge, a reminder that his worth wasn't tied to who showed up at his table on Christmas. He wandered through the house, finding a kitchen stocked with dishes and even a grocery list written in Laura's handwriting on the inside of a cabinet door. Coffee, bread, eggs, sugar. 2 bedrooms down the hall, one furnished with a quilt folded neatly at the foot of the bed, the other nearly empty except for a few boxes labeled George's things. He didn't open them. Not yet. Back in the living room, he sat in the armchair again, looking out at the yard. There was a birdhouse near the back fence and a bench under what would no doubt bloom into a flower bed come spring. The quiet here was different from the silence of his own home. That quiet had felt hollow, suffocating. This was peaceful, intentional. Laura had known. She had seen the slow drift of David and Melissa, the way visits grew shorter, the way Melissa spoke more often than David himself. Instead of confronting it, she had built a safeguard, a place just for George, untouchable, unshakable. For the first time in days, George leaned back in his chair and let out a long, steady breath. He wasn't alone. Not really. Not with this. The cabin lingered in George's mind long after he returned home. He hadn't unpacked his overnight bag, hadn't put the key away. It sat on the nightstand, glinting faintly in the morning light, as if to remind him that Laura's foresight was no accident. She had known. She had seen something in David and Melissa that George had been unwilling to face. Restlessness carried him next door to Carl Jenkins, his neighbor and oldest friend. Carl had been around for every chapter of George's life: barbecues in the summer, late-night repairs when something broke, long talks in the driveway. If there was anyone George could trust with this discovery, it was Carl. Carl greeted him at the door with a half-eaten slice of toast in one hand and his usual flannel shirt buttoned unevenly. "George," he said, eyebrows raised, "you're up early. Everything all right?" "Not exactly," George replied, holding out the envelope with the deed. "Got a minute?" Inside, Carl set his toast aside and adjusted his reading glasses. He studied the deed in silence, his face growing more serious with each line. Finally, he looked up, eyes sharp. "Hendersonville. Nice little town. But this isn't some accident. Your wife set this up deliberately. Your name's the only one listed. No joint ownership, no successor. Just you." George frowned. "Why would she do that?" Carl leaned back, folding his hands. "George people don't hide assets unless they're protecting them. From taxes, creditors, or family disputes." The words settled heavily between them. George thought of Melissa's tidy handwriting on the Christmas note, of her tendency to answer for David, of the way their visits had grown shorter each year. "Family disputes," George repeated quietly. Carl gave him a steady look. "You want me to be blunt?" George nodded. "I've seen it before. Kids or their spouses start circling once one parent is gone. Sometimes it's out of concern. Other times, it's about control. Your wife was smart. She saw something coming. This cabin, it's a safeguard. A way to make sure you have options no matter what." George's chest tightened. The truth he had been avoiding was now unavoidable. Laura hadn't just prepared for the possibility that he might be lonely. She had prepared for the possibility that their son might turn against him. Reaching into the envelope, George pulled out a smaller folded note he hadn't shown yet. He slid it across the table. Carl read it quickly and nodded. "She was making sure you'd never be cornered. If David or Melissa ever tried to push you out, this cabin is yours. No strings, no interference. They can't touch it." George leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight. "She knew," he whispered. "She saw it before I did." Carl's expression softened. "Laura always noticed the things the rest of us missed. She probably didn't want to burden you with it while she was alive. But she left you what you need. My advice: don't ignore it. And don't underestimate how far people will go when money's involved." George sat in silence, staring at the deed. Gratitude for Laura's foresight mixed with unease about what it implied. His son wasn't just drifting away. Laura had believed he might one day try to take what wasn't his. As George left Carl's house, the winter air bit at his cheeks, sharper now that he carried this new knowledge. He clutched the deed tighter, his steps slower, heavier. Laura had given him more than a property. She had given him a shield. But shields only mattered if there was something to protect against. And in the distance, George could already feel the storm beginning to gather. It was 3 days after his visit with Carl when the knock came. George had just poured his morning coffee, the steam curling upward, when tires crunched over the driveway gravel. Through the kitchen window, he saw David's silver SUV. His grip on the mug tightened. Melissa sat in the passenger seat, phone in hand, not even glancing toward the house. David, however, stepped out, jacket zip, shoulders tense. The knock was short, clipped, 3 raps that carried more impatience than warmth. George opened the door to find his son shifting uncomfortably on the porch. "Hey, Dad," David said, forcing a smile. "David." George's voice was flat. There was a pause. David shoved his hands in his pockets. "Thought I'd stop by. We haven't talked since Christmas." George leaned on the doorframe. "We could have talked then if you'd been here." A flicker of discomfort crossed David's face. "Yeah, about that. Melissa's mom, well, it just made sense this year." George held up a hand. "No need to explain. I read the note." David cleared his throat. "Right. Well, I wanted to check in, see how you're doing, and maybe talk about some things." George raised an eyebrow. "Things?" "Yeah, mom stuff. The accounts. I was in the garage the other day looking for that old fishing rod, and I saw some boxes with paperwork. Figured maybe you could use a hand sorting through it all. There it was. The real reason." George didn't answer right away. He just studied his son, the way one studies an opponent in a chess game, watching the opening move, weighing the intention behind it. "And what made you think I needed help with that?" David hesitated. His eyes flicked back toward the SUV, where Melissa was still glued to her phone. "Well, you've got a lot on your plate. Melissa and I were talking about maybe helping you manage things, just to make sure it's all in order." "For who?" George asked quietly. David blinked. "For you. For everyone, really." George stepped aside, gesturing toward the living room. "Come in." The house was warm, familiar, unchanged. David looked around as though he were seeing it for the first time. "Still looks the same," he muttered. "Some things don't need changing," George replied. They sat, George in his recliner, David on the couch. The silence stretched, heavy and awkward. Finally, George broke it. "So, tell me more about this help you're offering." David leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "We just think it might be good to consolidate things. Streamline. Maybe move some accounts around. We've been reading about how vulnerable older folks can be to scams or mistakes." George let the silence hang a beat too long, watching his son squirm. "Older folks, huh? I didn't mean." "No. I think you did." David shifted again, his eyes darting. George's voice was calm, steady, but sharper now. "Tell me something, David. Did you know Melissa forged my name on a check a couple of years ago?" David's head snapped up. "What? No, that's not. Don't lie." "I know it went to a contractor in Tennessee. $15,000. One of Melissa's rental projects." His son looked away, jaw tightening. The silence was louder than any denial. George sat back, folding his hands. "You weren't checking in on me today. You were checking on what I have." "Dad, it's not like that. For you, maybe it isn't. But from where I'm sitting, it looks a lot like you're trying to take over before you're invited to." David rubbed his face, frustration leaking through. "We just don't want things to get messy down the line." "Messy for who?" He didn't answer. Out the window, Melissa was still in the SUV, her phone pressed to her ear. She hadn't looked at the house once. "She's not coming in?" George asked. David shook his head. She thought it'd be better if I talked to you alone. George's lips pressed into a thin line. She's probably worried you'll say too much. You're overthinking this. No, George said firmly, leaning forward. I'm finally thinking clearly. The clock ticked in the silence that followed. I don't need help managing anything, George said at last. Your mother made sure of that. David's gaze sharpened. What does that mean? It means I've got everything I need. And I intend to keep it that way. For a moment, George thought his son might push harder. But then David's shoulders slumped. He stood, smoothing his jacket. All right. I'll see you soon then. George followed him to the door. Tell Melissa I said hello. David gave a small nod before retreating to the SUV. Melissa leaned over, said something as he climbed in, and within moments the car was backing out of the driveway. George stood at the door watching until the taillights disappeared. The house was quiet again, but not like it had been on Christmas night. This quiet carried a new weight, an understanding of what David and Melissa wanted, and just how far they might be willing to go to get it. And George knew one thing for certain. Laura had been right. This wasn't just drifting. This was a move. A play. And more were coming. George didn't have to wait long for the next move. Within a week, a beige envelope landed on his porch, hand-delivered by a man in a county-issued windbreaker. Notice from the court, the courier said briskly before walking away. George tore it open at the kitchen table. The words on the page were like a punch to the chest. Petition for guardianship. Filed by David and Melissa. His hands shook as he read. They were claiming he was no longer capable of managing his personal or financial affairs. The petition listed evidence, unpaid utility bills, forgotten banking passwords, and even an incident of leaving the stove on, a half-truth stretched into a weapon. Half of it was fabrication. The other half were small stumbles anyone could make. But on paper, it painted a picture of decline, a man slipping into incompetence. George's stomach tightened. This wasn't just about Christmas or abandoned dinners anymore. This was war. He reached for the card Carl had given him days earlier. Della Morgan, consulting, estate disputes, private planning. If Laura had trusted this woman enough to write her name in the papers with the note, in case of trouble, then George would too. When Della answered, her voice was sharp, professional. Morgan Consulting. This is George Whitman, he said. My wife, Laura. She left your name in her papers. She said to call if there was trouble. There was a pause. Yes. I knew Laura. She was very clear about the kind of man you are. What's happened? By noon, George was sitting in her office, the petition spread across her desk. Della's eyes scanned the pages quickly, her pen jotting notes in a leather-bound book. When she looked up, her gaze was steady. They've moved faster than I expected, she said. Guardianship petitions can be dangerous. Easier to get than most people realize, especially if the court believes you're isolated. I'm not isolated, George said firmly. No. But they're building a picture where you are. And unless we get ahead of it, that picture could become reality. She leaned back, folding her hands. Here's what we do. We build a paper trail, medical clearance proving you're competent, bank records showing you've handled transactions yourself, and witnesses who can testify to your clarity. Every scrap of evidence matters. If we stack the court file thicker than theirs, we win before the hearing even starts. And if we don't, her expression hardened. Then you lose control of everything. But we're not going to let that happen. The plan began immediately. Their first stop was the bank. George walked into the branch with Della at his side. The manager, Mrs. Alvarez, had known George and Laura for years. She greeted him with warmth. What can I do for you, George? I need 6 months of statements, he said. And any records showing I've personally made deposits and withdrawals. She glanced at Della, then back at him. Is everything all right? Family trouble, George said quietly. I need proof that I'm still steering this ship. Mrs. Alvarez nodded. You've been in here every month. I'll print a record showing that. From the bank, They went straight to Dr. Keller's office. He had been George's doctor for decades, and Laura's too. After a quick exam, reflexes, memory questions, writing a short passage, Dr. Keller leaned back in his chair. "George, you're as sharp as I've ever seen you. I'll draft a letter certifying full cognitive capacity." "That's exactly what I need, Doc," George said, relief washing over him. Next came witnesses. Della explained it bluntly. "We need people outside your inner circle. Shopkeepers, neighbors, anyone who can say they've seen you handle business clearly. The more ordinary, the better." George thought for a moment. "There's Raj at the grocery. Ellen at the hardware store. I've been handling everything myself since Laura passed." Perfect. One by one, they gathered statements. Raj wrote about George's weekly visits, how he compared prices, corrected errors on receipts, and remembered details most shoppers overlook. Ellen described his regular purchases at the hardware store and their conversations about repairs, sharp, specific, coherent. By the end of the week, they had a thick folder: bank records, a doctor's letter, 3 witness statements, receipts, and notarized documents. Della stacked them neatly, tapping the folder's edge against her desk. "This is a strong defense," she said. "And more importantly, it's the truth. That carries weight." George exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of both fear and resolve. Christmas night had left him hollow, stripped of family. But this fight? This stirred something else entirely. A spy. A fire. He looked across the table at Della. "Laura told me to trust you. And she was right." Della gave a faint smile. "Good. Because this is only the opening round. They think they can erase your independence with paperwork. But they've underestimated you. That's their mistake." George tightened his grip on the folder. For the first time since Christmas, he didn't feel like a man abandoned. He felt like a man preparing for battle. The courthouse smelled faintly of old paper and burnt coffee. Light filtered through tall windows, cutting across the polished wood benches in sharp lines. George sat at the defendant's table, his hands folded neatly, the folder of documents stacked in front of him. Beside him, Della sat poised, her notes arranged with the precision of a general before battle. Across the aisle, David and Melissa whispered to their attorney, a slick-haired man in a navy suit who looked more like a financial advisor than a family lawyer. Melissa's red nails tapped impatiently against the armrest, a steady rhythm that betrayed her nerves. David adjusted his tie over and over, never quite settling. When his eyes flicked toward George, they darted away just as quickly. The bailiff called the court to order, and the judge entered. A woman in her 60s, her presence commanded the room without theatrics. She scanned the docket, then fixed her gaze on the attorneys. "Let's proceed," she said simply. David's attorney rose first. His voice was smooth, rehearsed, almost too polished. "Your Honor, my clients are deeply concerned for the well-being of Mr. Whitman. They've observed troubling patterns of erratic decision-making, selling valuable assets, making impulsive donations, and most notably, attempting to transfer property under questionable circumstances. They fear for his ability to manage his affairs and wish to be appointed as his legal guardians. Their only motive is to protect him and preserve his estate." He sat down like he had just wrapped a closing argument. Melissa reached over and patted David's arm, the gesture practiced, meant for the room as much as for him. Della stood slowly. She didn't raise her voice, but her words carried weight. "Your Honor, my client has not lost his ability to manage his life. What he has lost is the goodwill of family members who see opportunity where they should see responsibility. The so-called patterns cited here are nothing more than ordinary, responsible decisions taken by a competent adult. What we will show is that the real motive behind this petition is not concern, but control, specifically control of a lakeside cabin that has been in Mr. Whitman's family for decades." The judge's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Proceed." Della began laying out the evidence. One by one, documents slid across the judge's bench. A notarized bill of sale for the old pickup truck, proving the transaction had been planned weeks in advance. A receipt and correspondence showing George's donation to the Veterans Fund wasn't impulsive at all, but part of a tradition he and Laura had kept for years. Bank records showing consistent deposits and withdrawals handled personally by George. Melissa shifted in her seat, her confidence faltering with each page. David stared straight ahead, his jaw tight. Then came the witnesses. Ellen from the hardware store was called first. She testified about her many interactions with George in recent months, discussions about repairs, purchases of specific tools, even small jokes they had shared. "He's sharp," she said firmly. "More attentive than half the younger men who come through my store." Next came Raj, the grocer. He spoke of George's weekly visits, his careful comparisons, his corrections when a price rang up wrong. "He knows what he's doing," Raj said. "Always has. If anything, I wish more customers paid as much attention as he does." Finally, Mark from the Veterans Breakfast described how George had recently helped organize coat donations, check sign-in sheets, and teased him about his handwriting. The courtroom chuckled softly, the judge included. Halfway through, David's attorney tried to undermine the testimony. "Mr. Whitman, isn't it true you misplaced an important bill recently and had to call your son for help?" George met his gaze steadily. "I misplaced a utility bill. Found it 10 minutes later under a newspaper. If that's grounds for incompetence, then half the state should be in guardianship." A ripple of laughter spread across the courtroom. Even the judge's mouth twitched. But the true turning point came when Della called Carl to the stand. Carl took the oath and sat, broad-shouldered in his pressed flannel. Della's tone was calm, deliberate. "Mr. Jenkins, can you share what you overheard at the Ridgeway storage facility involving the plaintiffs?" Carl nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I was dropping off tools when I overheard Melissa telling David that once they had the papers signed, they could list the cabin and split the money before spring. She said, and I quote, 'He'll thank us later when he's somewhere safe.'" The air shifted. Melissa's head whipped toward David, eyes flashing. David's face went crimson. Their attorney jumped to his feet. "Objection. Overruled," the judge said without hesitation. "Mr. Jenkins, you're certain of what you heard?" "Clear as day," Carl said. "Didn't sound like concern to me." "Sounded like planning a sale." A heavy silence followed. For the first time, David and Melissa looked unsettled, their confidence cracking in plain view. Della pressed her advantage, producing the trust documents that proved the cabin was legally protected, untouchable without George's consent. She highlighted the suspicious timing of their concerns, surfacing only after Melissa discovered the cabin was beyond their reach. When it was George's turn to speak, he didn't rely on documents or witnesses. He simply stood, voice steady. "Your Honor, I'm 72 years old. I've worked my whole life, served my country, and paid my bills on time. I am not perfect, but I am capable of making my own decisions. My wife and I built that cabin as a place for family, not a bargaining chip. If my son and daughter-in-law cannot accept that, that's their choice. But they do not get to take mine." The judge regarded him for a long moment, expression unreadable. Then she leaned forward. "Mr. Whitman, based on the evidence and testimony presented, I find no grounds to grant the petition for guardianship. Furthermore, I am issuing a protective order preventing the plaintiffs from interfering with your property or financial decisions. The court strongly advises both parties to seek counseling if they wish to repair their relationship, though that is outside this court's jurisdiction." The gavel struck. The sound echoed like a lock sliding into place. David's shoulders slung. Melissa whispered something sharp in his ear, but he didn't look at her. Their attorney was already gathering his papers, his expression distant, moving on to the next case. Beside George, Della allowed herself the smallest of smiles. "It's over," she said softly. Walking out of that courthouse, the winter sun felt warmer than it had any right to be. The cold air stung his lungs, but it carried something clean, something sharp freedom. Carl clapped a hand on his shoulder. "You held your ground, George. Laura would be proud." George only nodded, his throat too tight for words. That night, he sat at his kitchen table with a mug of tea, the house quiet. The photograph of Laura caught the lamplight from the counter, her smile steady, unwavering. For the first time in months, George didn't feel erased. He felt seen. He felt whole. The battle was over. But the war for his peace was only just beginning. The morning after the court's decision, George woke before sunrise. For once, it wasn't out of worry or restlessness. The house felt different, still quiet, but no longer suffocating. No looming court dates, no fear of papers arriving to strip away his life. Just the hum of the furnace and the faint tick of the clock in the kitchen. He made coffee the way Laura had always liked it, one heaping spoon of grounds, a pinch of cinnamon. The smell filled the kitchen, rich and familiar. Mug in hand, he stepped out to the back porch. The air was cold enough to sting his face, but it carried a freshness he hadn't felt in months. As the first light touched the lake in the distance, George realized the fear that had weighed on him since Christmas was gone. Not forgotten, but gone. The trust was in place. The cabin was untouchable. His independence had been defended in court, with the judge's ruling now standing as a protective shield. Laura's foresight had proven itself in every detail, and George, for the first time, felt he had room to breathe. Later that morning, he drove out to the cabin. Snow crunched beneath the tires as he turned onto the gravel road. The little white house with blue shutters stood exactly as he'd left it, waiting. Unlocking the door, George stepped inside and was greeted by the faint scent of cedar. He built a fire, the flames snapping to life, warmth slowly filling the room. Sitting in the armchair by the window, he thought not just of what he had won, but what he wanted to build from here. Laura had left him protection, yes, but also possibility. The next few weeks were spent not in fear, but in purpose. He called Carl to help repair the Veterans Center roof, spent afternoons at the hardware store swapping stories with Ellen, and even returned to the monthly veterans' breakfasts. Each handshake, each conversation was more than a simple act. It was a reminder that he wasn't isolated, that he still belonged. And then an idea began to take root. The cabin wasn't just a refuge for him. It could be more. He remembered Laura's grocery list taped inside the cabinet, the birdhouse in the yard, the note that read, "This is yours, in case they ever forget who you are." She had left him something lasting, but she had also left him the chance to turn it outward. When George met with Deller again, he laid it out plainly. "I want the cabin to outlive me. After I'm gone, it should be a retreat for veterans and their families. No sale, no private ownership. A place where people can feel whole again." Della studied him for a moment, then gave a slow, genuine smile. "That can be done. And it would honor Laura beautifully." Through January and February, George worked to make it real. The paperwork was filed, the trust expanded, the cabin prepared. In March, he hosted the first retreat. 10 veterans arrived, some with spouses, some with children. They cooked over the fire pit, swapped stories, fixed up the old snowmobile. One young father told George it was the first time in years he'd felt his family truly belonged somewhere. George didn't say much in response, he just nodded, but inside, something eased that had been heavy for months. Standing on the dock one evening, the lake half frozen and glowing under the pale sunset, George realized something profound. The revenge wasn't in humiliating David and Melissa, or even in winning in court. It was in this: reclaiming his life, turning Laura's foresight into something larger than himself, and proving that his worth wasn't measured by who chose his table. For the first time in a long time, George felt not just free, but purposeful. Spring thawed the lake slowly, breaking the ice into glittering shards that drifted toward the shore. George stood on the dock, hands in his jacket pockets, breathing in the crisp air. The cabin behind him was alive in a way it hadn't been in decades. Laughter spilling from the porch, the sound of children chasing each other around the yard, veterans swapping stories by the fire pit. It was everything Laura had envisioned when she left him the key. A safeguard, yes. But more than that, a beginning. David had tried calling once. His voicemail had been clipped, rehearsed. "Dad, we need to talk. Melissa and I made mistakes. Call me." George had listened, then set the phone down without deleting the message. For the first time in months, he wasn't reacting to them. He was moving on his own terms. A week later, a letter arrived, not from David, but from Melissa. 3 pages, handwritten. She wrote about her upbringing, how she'd watched her parents fight over property, how it had made her desperate for security. She admitted she had handled things poorly, though never quite offering an apology. She asked if they could find a way forward. George read it twice, folded it neatly, and set it in the drawer with his receipts for firewood. Not thrown away, not answered. Some things could wait. Because while they were busy circling his assets, George was building something they couldn't touch. The cabin was no longer just his refuge, it was becoming a sanctuary for others. He and Della had finalized the paperwork. After his passing, the property would never be sold, never broken apart. It would remain a retreat for veterans and their families. A place of belonging. A place to heal. That was the true revenge. Not anger, not courtroom victories, not even the protective trust that Laura had set up so carefully. It was this, quietly, deliberately shaping his legacy into something untouchable. Proving that no one, not even his own son and daughter-in-law, could erase his worth or his choices. One evening, as George stacked firewood by the cabin porch, a familiar voice broke the silence. "Dad." He turned. David stood at the edge of the drive, hands deep in his jacket pockets. His shoulders looked smaller somehow, less sure. "I heard what you're doing here," David said. "With the vets. I think it's good." They stood in silence for a long moment. "I'm not here to ask for anything," David added, voice low. "Just to say I'm sorry. It wasn't enough to undo what had been done. But it was a start." After David left, George walked down to the dock again. The lake rippled with the evening breeze, soft and steady. He thought about Laura, about the Christmas night when he had sat alone at the table, convinced he'd been forgotten. About the envelope she had hidden months earlier, the key she'd left for him, the quiet wisdom threaded through every step. Back then, it had felt like an ending. Now he understood, it had been the beginning. The revenge wasn't loud. It wasn't about winning in court or shaming David and Melissa. It was about standing in his own life again, building something stronger than their schemes, turning grief into legacy. The lake lapped against the dock, steady and calm. Somewhere in the distance, a loon called. George closed his eyes, letting the sound settle deep inside him. For the first time in a long while, he felt at peace. And that, he realized, was victory enough.